That will be a little way away. Yeah. If you are available, that might be useful. So let's now go to item 15, which is the eagerly awaited, hang on, get the right page, 53. The Hawke's Bay Marine Information Review and Research Strategy, and we have a number of stakeholders in the room, and a very warm welcome to you all. And I'll hand over to you.
Yes, thank you, Chair. So I'll just introduce, I'll just get Ollie, Wade and Dr. Tim Haggett to come up and just get themselves set up. They're going to run you through a presentation pretty soon around the work. So those of you who have not met Ollie Wade, he's one of our coastal scientists here with Hawke's Bay Regional Council, and Tim's a consultant from Lee in the far north who's done this work on behalf of the collaborative group who I'll probably launch into and just, I was going to suggest they come up to the table, but I think there's quite a reasonable group of them, so maybe we might just sort of, with the indulgence of the council, go through and just identify them. So we have staff from Ministry for Primary Industries. If you just, so, thank you. Department of Conservation. We've got representatives from the newly formed Napier Fishermen's Association. You gentlemen just want to... Thank you. Legacy Hawke's Bay, recreational fishing interest. Thank you. And Ngāti Kānunu Iwi Incorporated are also involved, but I don't think there's anybody here. Jonathan Dick today was involved in that. Right, not here. And sorry, Ellen and Christine from Waira, also representing tangata whenua interests. Sorry, I didn't spot them down the back. So perhaps just a little bit of context before we get into the presentation, which is quite enlightening. A year or so ago, Ollie and I had been talking around the issues that we saw growing or developing rapidly across the coastal landscape for Hawke Bay, particularly focused on concerns around the state of the region's fisheries. And when we sat down and talked about it, what we saw is that there was a great deal of about those resources and the habitats in the coast that we didn't know, that we could kind of rattle off a whole bunch of things that we would like to know more about that we didn't. And that the conversations that were evolving were rapidly kind of getting into a pretty tense space and weren't well informed by good solid evidence and information to help form and guide and shape the conversations. And so we saw that it was a real problem, not only for the parties who were involved outside of council, but also for council, because actually, as you'll see in the presentation, we have a pretty substantive role to play along with others in the management of the coastal space. So there was a need for us, or an absolute sort of recognition that we needed to get together what I call a gaps analysis. So to figure out what we knew, what we didn't know, and what we needed to know, to help us kind of shape the conversation and say, well, actually what we needed to do was, rather than debate the pros and cons of a particular approach or argue about what was right or wrong, what was perceived was a result of any particular action, was to start filling the gaps with some information to help shape the discussions and allow us to get to the space pretty quickly where we could identify what the real issues were that needed to be changed, addressed and managed differently into the future, ranging broadly across the coastal space, like I say. And that it was important that we look to collaborate in that space rather than end up in this kind of competitive or litigious sort of space. And we reflected that we have a real opportunity in the coastal environment, because in the freshwater and land space, we've got to that space where it's competitive and it's litigious. Actually, in the marine space, we've got the potential to be able to set things up quite differently if we get good buy-in and participation from all the players. So there was a real opportunity, and still is a real opportunity, to potentially do things a little bit differently in the coastal space. So with a view that we took on a leadership and a sort of a facilitative role, we brought together representatives from the group that we talked about, and we thrashed out a simple terms of reference and a scope, and got Tim on board to do this work. And as you'll see in the presentation, it's an incredibly important first step in what's going to be a much longer journey of discovery around how we deal with this now, because it's really set to us quite a significant challenge, and we need to figure out what we do next to deal with it. And in thinking about that, and we'll come back and have a chat about next steps after the presentation, what we're very, very keen to do is maintain a strongly collaborative and inclusive environment around the development of this work, and where do we go from here, so that we can potentially attract a stronger investment in the science and the work that happens in the region around our coastal space in future. If we set it up right, it's well structured and there's a clear view articulated by the community and all of the partners, stakeholders and agencies involved, it becomes an attractive place for people to come and invest in and see more work done. So we're really keen to see that happen. So we'll have a bit of a chat about the next steps at the end of the presentation. But what we want to do is present to you Tim's work, and take any questions. And like I say, just talk about where as staff we'd like to see this go from here. So I'll hand over to you. Don't forget to use the microphone too, please.
Yes, good afternoon, councillors, ladies and gentlemen. I'm going to hand over to Tim in a second to lead you through the presentation, but before we get started, I just wanted to draw your attention to a slight amendment to the report that was handed out to you all. Just to draw your attention to page 59 of the report, so that's page 271 of your agenda and attachments. So table 5.2, where it says it's a table of recreational catch data, that is actually a table of commercial catch data. And Leanne, did you have a chance to print out some? So you all already have the amended table. So just to clarify that for you. My name's Ollie Wade, so I'm a coastal scientist here, so I've been working with Tim on this project for the last 3 or 4 months. Now to pass you over to Tim to take you through our findings.
Great, thanks Ollie. Good afternoon councillors and everyone in the audience. And I'd like to acknowledge firstly to a lot of people in the audience who have contributed to this project as well, either providing data or just by way of historical information that they know of the bay. So we'll kick off the coastal marine area of Hawke's Bay, and the different roles that different agencies are involved with within this space. So we've got, of course, the council and land management, but also the out to 12 nautical miles, the marine space and the habitats within those. Involved is MPI with the Quota Management System, the Fisheries Act, and also biosecurity, and the various fisheries management areas and closures that are within the bay, which we'll go into in a bit more detail later. DOC, we've got marine reserves, and then there's a whole lot of other legislation with marine mammals and seabeds and various other things. So it's a really broad mandate. We have iwi and hapu, Ngāti Kāninu, iwi incorporated, and then we have the Tukutai Moana and the Rohi Moana. So as you can see, it's starting to fill up with a lot of squares and rectangles and management systems. And then we have just the commercial sector, FMA2, Port of Napier, Te Oahu Kaimoana, and then we have recreational fishers as well, legacy, all the sports fishing, clubs, etc. So, there's lots of activities, lots of values, and lots of legislation within that area, across New Zealand. So really, how do we put all that information together? Well, the first step was to collate what was out there, either data held by MPI, various reports that were in the council, and then amalgamate all of that into a GIS format. So it's basically put it all into the GIS, and then we're about to like go through the different layers, work out what sits on top of each other, and then utilise this information to start to begin to get a better understanding of the marine environment, the habitats within it, where everything exists. And then from there, develop a strategy. Okay, so where are the gaps? What needs to be done? In what order? And move through it that way. So, in order to get all this information together, we went through all the various publications we could find. And then we went out onto the road and tried to get as much local knowledge as we could. So in order to do that, we got maps of the area, organised meetings with commercial fishers, recreational fishers, iwi, various hapu, and went from Porongahau all the way up to Mahia. And essentially we drew lines on maps, and it was a really, really useful way of getting into some of the historical information that's either not been documented or, just inside people's heads, and that's, in my experience as a marine ecologist, that's often the best way to go. So we did that over a 2-week period. Then it all went into a geo database and GIS, and essentially we started off with the study area here on the left, and then we divided into different depths. So the purple bit here is 0 to 50 metres, the pink is 50 to 100, and greater than that is out to 200 metres. And we gridded the area up and then basically populated these grids with the various spatial information, habitats, fisheries, etc. And so now that that sits in a GIS database, we can start querying it. So, whereabouts are the habitats, rocky reef, what's on the rocky reef, is it near aquaculture, is it near port activities, and then you can start, once you start building that information base up, you can start having a pretty powerful tool. So here's it just in action in Mahia. These polygons here, these shapes are just different habitat types, and then overlaid on top of that is fisheries information. So the different colours represent different species. So we'll be able to tease apart what species are associated with different habitat types. I'll just walk you through some of the coastal habitat types. I think it's probably a pretty useful exercise. And the Hawke's Bay has as you all probably know, a diverse array of coastal habitats, from large estuary systems like the Porongahau up to the Ahuriri, and then lagoon systems up in past Wairoa and up to Mahia. We've got gravel beaches, and then really in the southern parts of Hawke's Bay, really extensive intertidal reefs, rocky reefs. And they have seagrass habitat and seaweed habitats on them, so they're really biologically important. And then Harding Road over here, which is a different intertidal rocky reef habitat with made up of small boulders, etc. So within these systems, there's a lot of biodiversity. Going underwater, we have mussel beds, which are really extensive around Napier. We have these mixed algal beds, and paua, which everyone wants to know where the paua is. Not many people would tell us. And then we sort of have these sponge habitats as well down in the southern Hawke's Bay. Now, this map here is a habitat map that was done in and around Aramoana, and Tiangiangi Marine Reserve is just that blue boundary line there. And this is really the only subtidal mapping that's been done in Hawke's Bay of the, where the actual habitats are. 2005, I think that was done. So, yeah, and these are really, really important habitats for a variety of things: fisheries, biodiversity, lots of different interactions happen in and around them. So basically the report findings are that the scientific information surrounding the coastal marine area is pretty ad hoc. There are some really detailed studies, but they are really limited in terms of a temporal scale. So, for example, Clinton Duffy from the Department of Conservation in 1992, he surveyed all the subtidal reefs, rocky reefs, but nothing's really been done since. So that's, it's going a fair way back now. The Hawke's Bay Regional Council studied environment monitoring is really detailed, and it's every year it's getting more and more diverse, sampling all throughout the region, but it only goes really back to 2006. So again, we've only got 10 years of data to really work out what might have changed in that time. So then going into the interview process, there are a lot of common themes that came through the interviews, and I'll go through those now. And some of them are being confirmed by scientific evidence that's been collected. So the first one that really struck out, going across all different stakeholders and sectors, was there's variation in the oceanographic climate. And by that I mean the spring equinox winds, so the northwest winds. Generally around the 1990s, they averaged way greater than 250 kilometres per hour, and now since 2000 it's changed. It doesn't average that at all, and that's been confirmed by the Hawke's Bay Regional, the climate data that's held here. Coupled with that has been a significant decline in water quality, and predominantly that's underwater visibility. So in around the 70s, it was common to have 20 metres visibility in around Pania Reef, all throughout southern Hawke's Bay. But, that's pretty much not the case anymore. I'll probably get to that in a minute, yeah. What else have we had? Yeah, there's been a reduction in the extent and the abundance in estuarine and shallow water shellfish beds, pipi tuatua, cockle, a whole range of things there. And a general perception of increased sediment loading within these systems, especially the estuarine ones. Again, that's been confirmed by state of the environment monitoring that the Regional Council undertakes. So we've got increased muddying of these systems. Some more things that came out of the interview process was there's an absence of historical species in some of the trawl fishing, for example, Hawke, and that's taken from logbooks that Rick Birch has provided us. An inability of tangata whenua to collect enough kaimoana for the marae, which is a common theme wherever we went. Change in the mixed status of the fisheries compared to the 1970s, 1990s period, and even going through some of the really old historic records, there's change. It's suggesting that the 1970s to 90s were, completely different to the 30s, etc. Reduction in bait fish and kahawai feeding fronts within the bay. Reduction in paddle crab numbers, and a change in the subtidal macrofaunal composition of the benthos, which I'll get to. It's a bit complicated wording. I just, as part of the information gathering process, I went back in to see some of the old papers and see if there's anything about fisheries and the marine environment. And the one on your left is from the Herald in 1910, and I don't know if you can make it out too clearly, but it's basically saying that westerly winds, poor fishing, basically crippled the flatfish industry over the 1910 to 1912 period. Fast forward to 2016, and you don't have to go too far. You see it in the papers all the time that the state of the fishery is the catches aren't what they used to, is the word on the street. This is just some information from MPI. Now, the top graph is divided into two depth strata. So the black one's the shallow region from 0 to 50 metres, and the red one is deeper water. Along the bottom, the x-axis, we've just got time from 2009 to 2015. And essentially what's happening is there's been a shift from the catches from shallow water to deep water. And that's confirmed by the commercial fishers too, interviews undertaken. So they're now not so abundant within the shallow, more abundant in the deep, and that's where they're targeting them. Coupled with that bottom graph there is just the ratio between shallow and deep water, which you can see that the majority in these years here was taken from the shallow, and now it's going into the deep. And then within Hawke's Bay, within Hawke Bay, there's a whole suite of fisheries management areas. Some of you will be really familiar with the Wairau Hard, which came into play around the 1980s as a way of preserving that important habitat. A lot of the Niwa scientists have suggested that this area here of the Wairau Hard plays a really important part as snapper nursery, equivalent to some of the larger, like Manukau Harbour, Kaipara Harbour up in Northland. And then we've got various mai vessel restrictions, commercial restrictions, all within the bay to help kind of manage that fishery. I mentioned there's a possible change in the benthic macrofauna, so that's basically the organisms living on the seabed. So over here, historical information and a lot taken from the commercial fishers was that the seabed was composed of these brittle stars and a lot of whelks. Now, there's been suggestion that it's now changed to predominantly being hermit crabs and these large starfish here. It's called Cosnosterius, 11-armed starfish. Both are scavengers. And in recent trawl trials undertaken by Rick, they're just pulling up in the trawls like bucketfuls or fish bins full of these starfish. So it suggests that there has been a real, a shift in that benthic community, which then translates into different effects throughout the food webs. Right, so water clarity. So basically, there's huge effects with sedimentation throughout Hawke's Bay. This top one here is Te Angiangi Marine Reserve, and the massive slip that happened in 2011. Coupled with the earthquake and the heavy rainfall event. And those effects still persisting today with high tides. This picture here shows the sediment plume that's emanating from that slip and that erosion still. So it all just goes out into the system. Talk to the commercial crayfishermen. This big erosion here moved into the subtidal and then across the reefs and then into deeper water. So when they set their pots, they're setting them into like big areas of sludge, They're bringing them back up and it's just all salty, black agnoxic sediment. So, it's all come from the land. The Tukituki River in full flood, you can see the sediment plume, this brown region going out into the coastal marine area, full of sediment, nutrients, etc. This one here is Prongahau, one of the tributaries that go into the Prongahau. There's just huge erosion because it hasn't been fenced, all the stock damage. Southern Hawke's Bay, we've got big cliff line erosion going for kilometres. And this picture here is one we took in April in the Clive. You've got cattle going throughout these systems, just sedimentation, erosion. So it's not fenced. There's other effects like nutrients that come in with the sedimentation. Of course, there's also naturally occurring nutrients that drive these phytoplankton blooms. So that's natural, but when you get an excess, these blooms, they're kind of single-celled algae can bloom away. And in one level, you'd say, well, that's really good for productivity because it drives things like zooplankton and then fisheries. But when in excess, as the bloom decays, it sucks oxygen out with bacteria. And when you get dissolved oxygen levels around about 30%, that's when you start getting fish kills, etc. Now, around this time of the bloom, the dissolved oxygen was around 40%. So, potentially, if you're getting a lot of nutrients going to the system, you can have adverse effects as well as positive effects. We've got stormwater and other discharges going into that system as well. And this is the Ahuriri estuary, where there's this brown waters and other phytoplankton bloom, which suggests excess nutrients. And then we've got localised effects like this dumping around the coastal vegetation in the Esk River this year. And there's the Ahuriri again with cattle going through Cicornia or glasswort habitat, and all of these are really, really coastally important habitat types. So there's lots of pressures. And we have direct impacts associated with the dredging and trawling. The dredging of the Port of Napier, the spoil gets dumped on these inshore areas here. And while there is really detailed and really, really good monitoring that goes on, there's lots of unknowns too, especially if around contaminants within the dredge spoils. But also, as cities grow, you're going to need more and more dredging, and you need to really work out, is this the best place to dump it in the near shore? And then, of course, we've got the effects of trawling, which are spread throughout the whole Hawke's Bay, but localised in the inshore various parts of these deep water areas here that are good for fishing. So while some of these effects are really localised or one-off or sporadic, when you kind of look at them in a cumulative capacity, you start the pressures on the marine environment are really direct, really, and often, in some ways it could be death by 1,000 cuts, So in terms of our knowledge gaps, because there's been really sporadic studies or ones that are limited in temporal duration, there are a huge amount of knowledge gaps. I kind of tried to summarise them all, but it just got too big. But I'll just run through them. But for the estuaries, there's we don't really know any historic loss of some of the habitats that were there. We don't know often where the sedimentation's coming from, where the nutrients are coming from, but we do know that they are increasing in their muddiness. For the intertidal and subtidal environments coupled, we don't really know how habitats might have changed, what's there, what's most under pressure, where the kaimoana areas are important for customary harvesting, etc., etc. Within talking to iwi, there's a significant, I wouldn't say, what would be the word? A bit of disenfranchisation there, but it was really heartening because they're putting a lot of effort into monitoring. Their hapu areas, the coastal, habitats and species, and trying to build up a picture, their knowledge base, which is really good. Fisheries, one of the big areas was that climatic variability. Like, how does that climate drive the fisheries? We all know that, we seem to know that when you get strong offshore winds, you get high productivity and you get good fishing. But if that's changed, then, what effect does that have on fisheries? We don't really know how those fisheries management areas are working, those closures. There's not very detailed information around those. And also, especially the Wairau Hard, if it's such an important area for nursery area, as well as our estuaries, we don't have any information on sort of what habitats are down there. And so, especially in the undersea space around the Hawke's Bay, there's just very little information at all, And if you don't have any information, you go into sliding baselines. So we don't know what it was like 30 years ago. If we don't know what it is like now, we don't know, and we don't monitor it, we don't know what the changes are going to be like, 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, So while monitoring doesn't have to be, I don't think it has to be expensive, but it can be done, and I think it should be done, because then you kind of put a stake in the sand and go, well, this is what it's like, and then you can start bringing in different management strategies surrounding these questions. So moving on to the strategy, there's 8 key components, and I guess the first one is collaboration, which is already happening. I'll just this book, Integrated Coastal Management, came out in 2007 by Raywin Pert, and it's sort of like the go-to Bible, really. And a lot of her recommendations are already happening, discussions. And one of the first ones is to step through all of that legislation, that everyone's bound by. Step through that, start having discussions and finding common ground. So it's really encouraging and heartening to see that's happening in Hawke's Bay. I guess the second one, these aren't mutually exclusive anyway. There's lots of integration around these strategies, but the second one was incorporating Mātauranga Māori into the monitoring. As I mentioned before, they're already starting to monitor, so all of that could just feed into more knowledge, work out what's important to everyone, work out what their values are, and moving forward. Alongside that would be integrated management of estuarine systems, and by integrated management I mean let's look at the whole catchments. Let's look at all the stresses. Let's look at the important habitat types. How do we protect those habitat types? A classic one for the Ahuriri would be stormwater. Let's drive that through wetland systems. Let's or look at better ways of managing stormwater. It doesn't need to just go straight into the estuary. There's so many techniques out there now that for better stormwater management. One I guess that's pretty close to my heart would be to develop the subtidal monitoring program, where those mussel beds and things like that are really important biogenic habitat for a lot of species. So to integrate that into a state of environment monitoring would be very useful. Alongside that is working out what habitat types are important for fisheries as well, and monitor those. And that also goes to soft sediment habitats, because most of the subtidal under the sea area is soft sediment habitats, but we also don't know how they're changing. But we do know from the commercial fishers that they're picking up different species in the trawls now. So it suggests that something's changed. So without monitoring, we don't know how significant that change is. The fifth point would be to develop a hydrodynamic model within Hawke's Bay. And the purpose of the hydrodynamic model would be that you'd be able to look at all those different stresses collectively and work out, and especially, with the ever-present climate change situations, is that if we can model the hydrodynamics, we can actually work out a lot of the effects, increased dredging, aquaculture, multiple activities together. So, I think that'd be really important to do. The 6 and 7 are really around fisheries and potentially to review the effectiveness of those spatial closures, or the different areas that restrict fishing methods. We don't really know, or are they effective, or if they are, what species are really increasing or decreasing, and also within that just to look at different habitat linkages, because juvenile habitats are completely different to adult often, and they'll move through these different linkages. And if you've got, say, your juveniles are being affected by a certain habitat type that's not there now, then you're going to get bottlenecks, which could have downstream effects on the wider fishery. And some of these strategies are easier than others, but I think it's important that we have the discussion around some of the bigger ones as well. And I guess the last one is ongoing work on that GIS database. So putting some of the MPI data, the TRAW data, into that database and over the top of habitat data, and kind of like starting to filter out like where are these fisheries where are the fish going, what are they doing, what habitats are they associating with, So I really, it's just really basically we're on the tip of the iceberg now, moving forward. But it's been and that's not exhaustive anyway. List too. That collaboration point 1 will basically, as part of that, is to go through the strategy and work out which ones are probably doable. Are there other ones that haven't been considered? But I'll leave on a good a good note, and that there's already catchment management strategies happening within the bay too. So it'd be good if it's extended to a lot of different areas that are under a lot of pressure. But I think I'll leave it there, and I'd just like to say that this is one of the best projects I've had over my career. I've really enjoyed putting everything together and working with the different people, and I think it's exciting times within Hawke's Bay as well. So yeah.
Great. Thanks, Tim. So perhaps just before we get into the questions, and I'm sure there's going to be a forest of hands, I'll get James to provide a little bit of comment soon, because fortunately for us, he's come from a background that's going to be helpful for us moving forward, I'm sure. But right now, next steps are obviously critical. You see that there are a group of passionate and enthusiastic people here supporting us in this work around the coastal space. We probably need to think about a broader group. We certainly need to think hard about that list. We need to think hard about what the priorities are. We need to think hard about the detail that sits in each and every one of those, because there's going to be a lot in there, how we're going to fund them, when we need to do them by, and then ultimately all of this will need to feed into some process that picks up the information that we're gaining and turns it into action. And that may well be a change in the way we manage resources, or the changes the way we as a council set policy to reflect what we're learning about these linkages and relationships in the coastal environment. So we're at a very, very good space. There's a lot of interest politically in what's happening in this region. We have a fantastic opportunity. From my perspective, I'm working really hard to maintain an environment that attracts investment into the region, into the space, because as you can see from Tim's list there, there's a lot of work for us to do, and it's not just for the regional council, it's for the collective groups that hopefully will get together around this to lock in this work. But right now we've got a real opportunity to attract investment into the region and get some of the stuff underway. Look, I'll pass over to James, but just also when you get to the questioning, I'd also invite you, Chair, with your indulgence, please. I'm sure that the participants in this process will be happy to answer questions as well that councillors might have.
Thank you, Ian. Look, I thought I'd just make a brief couple of comments about the institutional landscape, because I imagine that a number of councillors are wondering about what precisely is our responsibility in the coastal environment. Where does that start and stop, and how does our work relate to that of others? So, look, the marine environment is governed by 26 different pieces of statute and almost as many institutions operating over the top of one another, and it's been a long-standing issue in this country that there is not an integrated approach to marine management, nor is there one single piece of statute or one single organisation that has a responsibility for overall management or coordination of the system, for want of a better term. So that's a long-standing issue. The previous Labor government had a go at trying to deal with this with what was called Oceans Policy. Some of you may recall Dame Kath Tizard going around New Zealand, building a constituency, if you like, for an integrated approach to marine management. Unfortunately, that work, as well received as it was, ran headlong into the foreshore and seabed debate. And the Labor government at the time had to shelve any plans on that. When the national government came in, officials from the range of agencies involved advised government that there remained a disaggregated, fragmented and overly complicated set of arrangements in the marine environment, and that this warrants further review. It's fair to say, I think, that the current government's looked at that with some trepidation based on the politics of foreshore and seabed, the complexity of dealing with the property rights that exist under the quota management system, the huge passions which the marine environment kind of brings to the table. And there has been some tentativeness around any major legislative or structural reform around responsibilities. The closest we've got to it is the Marine Protected Areas policy that the central government's consulting on at the moment. And that policy, should it be enacted into legislation, would provide for statutory processes, collaborative processes, or board of inquiry processes, depending on what a community decided. And that would enable a collaborative group to come together and recommend to central government a package of management tools, everything ranging from recreational fishing zones through to species protected areas, etc. That work is ongoing, and it's not known at this point in time whether or not legislation will be brought before the House before the end of this term of Parliament. But I'd have to say that I think the chances of getting that enacted before the 2017 general election are probably pretty low. So where that leaves us today is that there remains some ambiguity as to the leadership of marine management issues at a regional level. But I would note that some regions have stepped forward. Auckland Council, for example, has run a multi-year process called Sea Change, which has been a collaborative stakeholder effort to bring all the different bits of legislation, all the tools, all the knowledge together and develop a package, if you like. And the community in Kaikoura similarly did something, and they went to government and asked for bespoke legislation. So the Te Korowai Act, which was enacted, I think, last year, provides a whole range of different controls at the community level for whale watching and recreational fishing and protected areas and what have you. So one option is that you can go to central government and petition them for a special piece of legislation. Our recommendation at this point would be very much that the regional council is well positioned to take a leadership role, particularly in terms of convening and facilitating multi-stakeholder dialogue. But just want to underscore the point that we have no powers within our gift as a regional council to control fishing methods or the take of fishing, or to impose things like marine protected areas or marine reserves. So we very much need to work with other institutions to put together a package of management response to all the issues that you've heard about today and that will continue to come through from the information base. So this is very much a collaborative endeavour. The legislative regulatory landscape's pretty messy, and that's not likely to change in the near term, so we do need to work with our partners.
Right, let's get into some questions, starting with Tom.
I guess this is a hugely impressive piece of work, and at least the first question I have is, from the time you were commissioned to do this till today, how long did this piece of work take you to do?
3 months.
3 months.
Yeah, lots of late nights, but
It's even more impressive. It seems to me, given what James has said, that when you look at your strategies, each of your strategies comes down to some actions that could be taken, all of which are data and analytic actions. So how long would it take to sort of grid that out, given the number of players involved, and sort of identify, well, who might be responsible for filling some of those gaps? And some of those I would take to require multi-year trend analysis. Others might be quicker. When can we get more precision as to what the gap filling would actually look like, and what pieces could be done sooner versus later?
yeah, well, I sort of envision having a 2-day workshop to get all the stakeholders around and go through each of those points and go, okay, who's where's the responsibility lie? What would be the best information that we could get in the most effective way, and you need to put some sort of dollar signs around those as well, and then I think once you do that, then you can go, well, okay, well, we can tick that off pretty easily. Let's integrate that into, for example, state of the environment monitoring. Some of these bigger fisheries, questions. We'll probably, start off small, but then build momentum as they go forward, and they might take, several years. But a lot of the, to get some of the information, you're looking at maybe a week survey or less, So I guess to answer your question, what I've suggested is not out of the realms of possibility, and everything could be done in a, if you had to tick everything off on that list, you could do it in a 5-year period. I'm convinced. Yeah.
So it's a really pertinent question, Councillor, because now we need to turn that into our list of what do we need to do, what are the component parts for each one, and it's no surprise that it's turning up at your table now, because fairly soon we're going to be moving into a discussion around long-term plan. It's not that far away, and we may well be coming back to you with a bit of a list of things we would like the council to be active in once we've had that discussion with our partners in this space.
So from what has been done so far, in listening to you, you mentioned one particular, what I call low-hanging fruit possibility, when I think you mentioned stormwater into the Ahuriri estuary. From what work has been done, this strikes me a little about like Peter's project on coastal impacts. There's a need to take this big, long-term, holistic view of things, but we also have folks who want to deal with some short-term things that are sticking in their face. Can you envision this being managed in a way that there would be some earlier actions taken, some low-hanging fruit here that would build some momentum? I'm sure there are going to be some people who react to this by saying it's a terrific report, but when will we do something?
Oh yeah, I think that's really, really valid points. I think in and around the estuaries, surrounding the integrated catchment management, like you said, wetland restoration's already happening. I think a really easy one is to fence these estuaries, get the stock out. Start making small little changes that all kind of will start having a bigger effect down the track. So I think maybe starting with the estuaries would be a really, really useful, starting point. Making those changes. Okay, how do we stop the sedimentation? Let's plant. Let's get planting initiatives. Let's get wetland restoration things happening like that. So that'd be the low-hanging fruit. Yeah.
Some names, Councillor Scott, then Mr. Moy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you very much for this very thorough and very exciting report. I've got 6 very detailed questions, but I'd like to ask my big question up front right now, and that refers back to the background paper where we're talking about bringing information back to the long-term plan. Yet I hear Mr. Palmer saying attracting investment into the region, and I've looked at the strategy, the strategy that's attached in the National Science Challenge. Is it possible that we can start immediately on seeking some of that funding to do further research? And I ask this question, Mr. Chairman, because if we get appropriate answers, then I would like to foreshadow a further recommendation.
So there are a number of sources of funding that we can apply to. We have been looking at the National Science Challenge, and for good or ill, they have decided to focus their efforts on the Tasman Golden Bay area because of the confluence of different activities and interests happening there. There is a dialogue underway with the science leadership of that program to see whether at the margins of their program there is funding that could come our way. The biggest source of marine research funding in New Zealand comes from fisheries management under MPI, and that's around $22 million a year. That has, in real terms, essentially been flatlined for about the last 15 years. So so in real terms it has been diminishing. And one of I'll give you my personal view, one of the unfortunate consequences of cost recovering all of our fisheries research, with a vast majority of it from industry, is there's constant downward pressure and political pressure on the use of those funds. And so it hasn't grown over time, and $22 million for the entire EEZ and inshore environment doesn't go very, very far. Now, MPI tell us they have set for the next year's budget some funding aside, and I couldn't give you exactly how much, but there is a sum earmarked for the Hawke's Bay region, so we'll be looking to leverage that. And in late-breaking news, some councillors may be aware of a letter that was issued on Monday from the National Aquarium looking for letters of support to central government around funding a regional research institute for marine off the back of the National Aquarium. And we understand that central government are looking reasonably favourably at that. Now, the question will be how much of that funding would go into bricks and mortars, particularly in terms of laboratories and what have you, and how much funding would be available for ongoing research, which is perhaps a higher priority in our view than building a building. But there's also vessels, buoys, all those sort of things that need to be acquired as well. So there are a range of funding sources, and I think we can move reasonably quickly with trying to attract that funding. But obviously the council having resources on the table to match the resources of others will be quite important as well. So that's where the long-term plan comes in.
Just adding to that, council too, since this has surfaced, there's quite a level of activity and interest from the Crown Research Institutes in this, what we're doing. The commercial sector, Fisheries Inshore New Zealand. So there are pots of money that float around that may be relevant to this. Just reinforce it's about making it attractive, and it's about showing a strategy. So we can join all those resources up and achieve a hell of a lot more than we can by working in isolation.
Followed up, I'll give you one else, so I won't go right through my list.
Well, could you, just a suggestion, maybe you could ask those questions offline, the 6 detailed questions that follow. If you've got one more though, let's go. We've got a lot to get through, Councillor.
I think this is the most important paper we've got on the table today, Mr. Chairman.
Probably.
I'm just not sure, you've covered, Mr. Palmer, what's going on elsewhere as far as looking at bringing the legislation together, etc. But would this actually be, in looking at the land, and I know that there are other catchments such as Aratiri and the Ruatanapa Inlet that have looked at that land interface in the fisheries interface, but only on a very small scale. Would this be nationally leading edge in looking at such a overall management area?
Look, Mr. Maxwell might want to comment on the issues, particularly around the interface between land and water, given the considerable science effort being put into supporting freshwater reform. Clearly, the area of largest responsibility for the council, and possibly one of the biggest drivers of environmental change in our coastal environment, is sediment. There is funding confirmed in the budget for further freshwater science endeavour, and it may well be that we can make the case to central government for that expanding into the marine environment where freshwater reform, freshwater management is having a coastal impact. Indeed, we are required to take into account coastal impacts in doing freshwater reform, but I think we've heard today that we've got a limited evidential base on which to understand that. So, look, we've got a huge amount of work to do ahead of us as we get further and further up Hawke's Bay, looking at catchments such as Mohaka and up into Wairoa district. Sediment is going to become more and more a focus for us in terms of the freshwater science program and the freshwater planning work. And so I think the opportunity is that we align the work that we're doing on the coastal environment with that work so that we get a complete picture.
Yeah, look, completely agree. I guess the challenge is that we have legislative environments that draw hard lines on the map, but the science or the ecology doesn't. So it doesn't stop at the mean high water springs. It carries on out in the ocean, as Tim just explained. The reality is, though, that the science community now is joining all that up, probably have done for years. They're just now more active and pushing that message that you don't stop your consideration of natural resource management at the coastal interface. You've got to deal with the impacts of what you're doing on the land as it relates to coastal processes. Fortunately, we're pretty well placed. As James has mentioned and Tim pointed out, sedimentation is a huge issue for us in terms of our freshwater quality. It's looking like it's going to be a significant issue for us in the coastal space. So whatever improvements we can make on land and freshwater will have corresponding benefits in the coastal marine area. And we know from some of the work we've done recently that if we successfully roll out our policy interventions and catchments like the Tuki, we can make substantive reductions in sediment loads. That corresponds to that picture probably still being brown, but not as brown in a flood on the coast when the Tuki's in flood. So, yeah.
We'll do that very shortly. Okay, well, we can do that in the form. Are you happy with that? But Mr. Moy had his hand up. No. You're happy? So you happy to take your further questions offline?
I'll ask the staff, Mr. Chairman. I think it's a pity that we cut short what I think is one of the most exciting papers that we've had delivered to us for a long time.
Mm.
In which case, Mr. Chairman, I have to move an amendment. So once it's seconded.
You seconded?
I'll second it.
You happy to second? So you wish to speak? You've moved it.
This, I take up Councillor Belford's, I'll plagiarise this thing, hugely impressive piece of work, just well done. For an equally huge problem, I know we're using the word huge, but the challenges, as you outlined, we all kind of figured that, and we've watched the sediment and we've watched the fisheries decline. Well, our fishermen tell us that, and we've just got a huge challenge ahead of us, and I'm really pleased, and I know this has been close to Mr. Maxwell's heart since I've been a councillor anyway, and I'm really pleased that whoever's activated and got you down here and got our own staff involved have done this. This is seriously good stuff that we all want to get involved in. We know we've got a problem, and the collaborative, we've got to get together with the commercial guys, the recreational guys, everybody who has a stake in this, and there's heaps of them, and work this out, how we're going to manage this resource of ours much better than we have, because we're doing a terrible job. Doing a terrible job in our hills, estuaries, just everywhere. So it's a massive problem, something that's close to all of our hearts, and I just want staff to get on with it, and our leadership is the issue here. Let's show some leadership, let's do this, and let's be the leading edge contributors to this scheme, because it's all around the country it's the same. So congratulations to everybody.
Thank you. Seconder, Mr. Speaker.
Microphone. Firstly, to the people who construct the report, brilliant report, great stuff. In my view, it deserves more attention than it's getting here today. And I think that we have, I just make the point to Liz again, the Chief Executive, is that as councillors we have no control over the agenda. It seems to me that this is an appropriate document to have gone to a committee meeting where we had time and space and things to do it, rather than at the council meeting. I just think we're in the wrong space here. I get a sense from all the councillors we'd like a lot more time to speak on this, and I certainly would. But I'm not. The other thing I just make is a little observation as we go through. You talked about lack of information. If you're in business, there's a key phase. If you can't measure it, you can't manage it. And that's what you were telling us here. We can't manage things we don't measure. If we don't measure them, we can't manage them. That's our fundamental problem. I just think that's the essence of that. So if we're going to manage something, say we have responsible manage, then we have to measure it. And that's just what we have to do, just a given. And yes, it's going to take some time and sequence, but I would like to have had a broader debate on the issues that James has raised. Yes, I've been involved where lots of discussions about fisheries and things, and it is a web of legislation.
intersections, overlaps, emotion, a frightful area to get into. But as complicated and as challenging it is, what this report says to us is that we must. And if we're going to get involved in this, what is the outcome that we're looking for? And I haven't got clarity on that. So I would like us to, to be clear about what it's we're going to do. Other areas have been clear and getting some bespoke legislation. Yes, I was aware of that. That's a great outcome for them. But what is our outcome? What is our desired outcome? And I just think we need to be clearer about that, because when we're clear about that, all the other things will take place in the full sequence. And I just can't help it. I'm sorry for this. I find this irresistible. This is going to cost a lot of money. Deserves a lot of money. And here we have on the table a proposal to spend $36 million on water and the tuki-tuki. We should have this as part of the extra. So we should be able to say, we prefer this over that. Now, if we've got $36 million from some extra water, we should be putting this up against that $36 million and say, what do we want better in the long term? That's the issue this council has to have. That's about governance, about vision and leadership. And we can't make these decisions at the micromanagement level. One ad hoc here, one ad hoc one there. This has got to be something which we look as a council and integrate everything. James alluded to it. What we're doing on the land is going to affect what we do in the sea. We need, as a council, a broader think about what is it we're trying to achieve here, and they all integrate. Where's the money going to go?
Mr. Chairman, I would like to move an amendment, and I had foreshadowed this earlier. And that is a new point 4 that requests that staff actively pursue funding through appropriate research, actively pursue appropriate research and development funding to lead a multi-agency approach to develop the next stages in making integrated management, can't read my own writing, of land and sea, of enabling an integrated management of the land-sea interface.
Can you read it again? Because I'm sure it's clear.
Yep, I'm sorry. I kept changing it as I went. Request that staff actively pursue appropriate research and development funding to lead a multi-agency approach to develop the next stages in enabling integrated management of the land-sea interface.
So you wish to speak?
It was seconded, yep. Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I put that in because I don't want to see this work, and is it Mr. Haggett or Dr. Haggett? Dr. Haggett, sorry, don't want to underestimate your qualifications. Said it's one of the most exciting studies that he's done, and certainly when I read this, I found it one of the most exciting and forward-thinking research projects that we have got on our books. This is really looking at an overall integrated management, and I know it's been done on a very, very small scale in some of the catchments, and we have had presentations to this council on the achievements that was that came out of dairy farmers and fishermen working together to get a much better outcome. This actually is a hugely bigger project, and it deserves getting off the ground now. We don't want in the next long-term plan only just to be starting our monitoring or starting our something there. We'd like to see this momentum started and ramp up as it goes on. So I do urge my fellow councillors to support this amendment, because I don't want this to be left to lie for another year or 2 years before we start making progress on finding a way of furthering this research.
Thank you. Seconder, Councillor Hewitt.
Thank you. I'm pleased to support this amendment. It doesn't detract from the previous speakers, it merely adds to the debate, and I'd like to congratulate you gentlemen and your support people who've turned up here today for the time and effort that you've put into this project. And Tim, you said this has been the highlight of your career, one of them. It shows when you speak, we could tell, and I really enjoyed your presentation. Amongst 3 inches of paper that arrived in my mailbox on Friday, I agree, this was the highlight. I said to Paul Drury when I was speaking to him, as I was going through some other questions, gosh, fancy bearing a report like that amongst, all of this.
All stuff.
Yeah, I mean, it really was. It was a bit of a shame. I mean, so I did get to it and I thoroughly enjoyed it. I'm a coastal dweller much of my time, and what you're saying here, it just matches up with my layperson observations over the period of 3 decades and my husband's over 5 decades. There are some huge challenges. Coastal sedimentation is not just from farming practices, but in my neck of the woods, which is Central Hawke's Bay, we've had this weather bomb, and while you see pictures in your project from the 2011 floods, which are still putting sedimentation in. I mean, one coastal example I'm speaking of is from a previous flood many years ago, and still every high tide, twice a day, that sedimentation's getting drawn out over a rocky area, and we call it Muddy Point, where there's been crabs. The crab population is just going dwindling and dwindling. Used to be able to pull them up and find a dozen easily. Now you might find 1 or 2 under some rocks. So I attribute that directly to the sedimentation. I observe it in the power size, and that'll be spread throughout the whole region. So I know there will be no shortage of getting communities in behind you with this work, and I commend the staff to get on with it. I've been really looking forward to seeing the tie-in in my time of regional council between the work we're doing on the land and the work we're doing on the coast, and this is a fabulous piece of work. So thank you.
Other speakers to the amendment? Councillor Belford?
Yeah, I think of this as being potentially akin to the Coast to City project in terms of its scale and funding sources and diversity. And the other thing about that project is it seems to me that it combines research with actual action to do things along the way, which I think is really critical to this to maximize the full value of it. The only other comment I wanted to make is that it seems to me in doing that, we would also sharpen our advocacy role vis-a-vis central government in this whole situation. In this discussion today, MPI has gotten off lightly as far as I'm concerned, and that is something that is of huge interest to both our commercial, recreational fishers, iwi, and I'd hate to see us researching while we didn't also figure out what we want to say about actually protecting these fisheries as quickly as we can possibly get on with doing that.
There's no other speakers to the amendment. Do you wish to sum up?
Mr. Chairman, it seems to me there is quite a lot of support for getting this work off the ground as soon as possible, and I tried to make the recommendation as broad as possible to leave as much area as possible to move in the most appropriate way, but I do stress the importance of the first time that we have actually moved into a land-sea interface with an integrated management, and I think this is a real step for the future. And again, I would like to acknowledge all those people that are sitting behind me who have put work into this, because this is the approach that we need to really make huge gains for the future.
So I'll put the amendment. All those in favour, please say aye. Contrary, no. Carried. That now becomes part of the substantive motion. Any other speakers?
I support the motion, but what I also support is Councillor Barker's comments. This should have gone to a committee. It's not being. We're unable to give it the due consideration it deserves because of time constraints. And dare I say it, the next item on the agenda, Regional Science Sector report, I believe that should be forwarded to the next Environment and Services Committee meeting, which is not far away. Why do we have committees? So that we can deal with things in detail and then deal with the outcomes at council.
Thank you. You wish to sum up, Mover?
Except to say that it's all been said. You clearly have huge support, all of you that are behind this, and I just want to get on with it.
Okay, I'll put the motion then. All those in favour, please say aye. Contrary, no. Carried. A huge vote of thanks to all you people who have turned up today. Thank you very much for your diligent work. I think we're on the beginning of quite a good trail. to tidy up some of the challenges we see in our bay. Being a recreational fisherman of some average ability myself, I wish you all well, so thank you. Okay.